It was an extraordinary occasion. I mean, you can look at it in, I think, two very, very different ways. Let's, to show everybody that we are not completely blinded either by our passions, our history, or our politics. One view of it is it was the most completely Ruritanian exercise I think one could possibly imagine. Here here is the most powerful man in the world being driven by horses round a garden, with, of course, immense panoply, with the splendid Irish state coach, the Scottish state coach, all the king's horses and all the king's men that did in fact manage to put him together again, the marching bands, even with a certain dash of Knickerbocker glory, and American troops in the buff and, is it buff and blue? I can't remember what the Washington colours are, marching with them. And of course, it's exactly what the whole Tony Blairite left of Britain said we want to get away from. But curiously enough, and I think you as an American are able to count on this, if, for example, we had followed the example of the 2012 Olympic opening celebrations, and instead we'd given President Trump a detailed choreographical account of the NHS, do you think he would have been quite as excited?
I think he might have been less enthusiastic. But David, you and I both found President Trump's speech at the Windsor banquet extraordinary. I, because it touched so faithfully on what I personally admire so much about Britain, the great legacy of our American inheritance, the freedoms, values, and cultures.
So what we're doing now, Lee, we're now swapping from my wicked characteristic giggle to what you could argue is genuinely very serious. That, remember, all this is neo-medieval. All of everything that we saw is really it's not absolutely invented from nothing, but it's reinvented and polished at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. The perfectly choreographed ceremony, the immaculately marching troops, the perfectly playing bands, and all the rest of it. But I think there's one thing that it's, before we move on to the points of substance, which you are correctly pointing to, there's one thing that's very striking about it, Lee, which is all of that perfection of ceremony was deliberately polished for a monarchy that was on public display. It was done for a monarchy that was adjusting to democracy. And the places that it was perfected were the Mall, the Admiralty Arch, at one end, at the other, the great monument to Queen Victoria, and that enormous roundabout in front of the facade of Buckingham Palace, which, when the man who designed it came up with the idea, explained its function to the royal princesses, the royal princesses say, "Oh, won't the people be able to get very close?" And Viscount Esher, Reginald Brett, says, "That's the idea." But of course, what was striking about President Trump's visit was that the people, because they couldn't be trusted not to hold up rude signs and inflatable images of President Trump doing obscene things, were carefully excluded from it. So you had this immaculate ceremony designed for public exhibition, reduced to a private show. And we've had earlier discussions on this extraordinary court quality, monarchical quality of the Trump presidency, but it's the ceremony of it is internal. It is like the old days of aristocratic or absolute monarchy. The ceremony takes place in the palace. Of course, the way it's exhibited, and this is very striking, it's exhibited through controlled media. Those extraordinary performative scenes in the Oval Office, which we've talked about so often after the inauguration, when Stephen Miller, the Assistant Chief of Staff, is standing behind, there's a great pile of executive orders. But the press is there, but it's broadcast to the world as it were, as the president wants it to be seen. Similarly, this entire thing is broadcast to the world. I don't know whether you saw, there was the enormous, is it 3 Mile Walk or whatever it is, that goes from the garden facade of Windsor Castle right to the statue of George III, well into the park. And it was actually screened. I mean, the cameras carefully didn't look at it, but there was very much the equivalent of the Mexican wall built along it, so that protesters couldn't get there. So I think we need this curious framing of ceremony, and then to look at what you've just been raising. I mean, again, I was very, very struck by the president's speech. I mean, the king's speech was a series of bland nothings, but the president's speech was very remarkable. I mean, I think, again, it was underestimated because, of course, Trump does not normally read speeches. Everybody, the unkind commented on unkind remarks like kindergarten readings age and whatever, because he's freewheels. That when we see Trump speaking, he's normally freewheeling, which he does very effectively. But this was clearly a highly polished and prepared text. In which, he, as you said, he hails not simply the bond, not simply conventional remarks about the special relationship. He actually says Britain and America are born at the hip, are joined at the hip, or rather that America is given birth to, literally, by England, by Britain. He goes on and sees again that paean of praise to, of all things, the British Empire, in which he says, the origin of the American ideals of freedom, justice, liberty are in the British Empire, of which it is the eldest offspring, at the same time that that empire transmits those values around the world. I mean, completely astonishing. Any idea who wrote it?
I don't, but I wanted your take on some specific things that he said, particularly about the king and monarchy, and particularly about the king. And I was thinking in the back of my mind, there are a lot of people, particularly on the right, that don't always agree with the king. What are they thinking about this? What he said, David, was, and I'd love to hear your reaction. He said, quote, during the toast, for many decades, His Majesty the King has epitomized the fortitude, nobility, and the spirit of the British monarchy and the British people. He's dedicated himself to preserving the glory and unique character of this kingdom, restoring life to the rivers and streams, supporting the works of its artists and composers, planting trees and garden in its countryside. He has uplifted the poor, cared for rural farmers, and tended to wounded veterans like nobody else. He talks about the king entirely motivated by a desperate desire to put the great back in Great Britain. Could you react to that?
Yes, I mean, I think this is this is why I asked you who wrote it. This is an exceedingly clever spin to put on the king's ecological interests, which in many ways cut right across what the president is trying to do. Here is a president who says "drill, baby, drill," whereas the king, is profoundly aware of, indeed, is one of the great advocates and has been long before it became fashionable, of the need for net zero, of the importance of those preposterous windmills that again President Trump laughs at. But what you can see done there is what I think most characterized this, which was something again that particularly on this side of the Atlantic, and I don't think we've talked about this before. What is the reason that Trump is actually widely disliked here? As well as there are other groups that are fond of him. But what is the reason that otherwise, I think, completely independent minded English people, or especially, or Scots, whatever, dislike him? I think the answer is that he is seen as being bad mannered. this very characteristic English notion that there should be constraints on public behaviour, and that he is somebody who regularly breaks those constraints. And what was extraordinary about this visit is that we saw a largely novel President Trump, who was immensely civilized, who went out of his way to behave well to his hosts, to be mutually accommodating, to lavish with praise, some of which clearly was not scripted. I mean, the comments on the Princess of Wales and so on, it sounded to me to be very much typical Trump ad-libbing. And it was, I think, a masterstroke to place the two of them together at dinner. But it was, as it were, the fact. Here we saw a Trump, the opposite of the kind of Trump, the bullying Trump of the Zelensky. I mean, in terms of his reputation in Britain, I think Trump did himself much more damage by the Zelensky interview than by anything else. Because what he was doing, he was seen as that least English of things, which is bullying down. Somebody who is much less powerful than he is, and behaving unfairly. And we saw a very, very different President Trump. And one could hardly, I mean, even stretching my in general very favourable view of him, I could hardly call him gracious, but he was nudging in that direction. And of course, we have a king who, whatever his private feelings may be, is in terms when he is required, performs with genuine graciousness and immaculate politeness. And so it was again, not an adjective would normally come to my lips when I'm talking about President Trump, almost genteel occasion. We're going back to the 18th century. Yes.
Well, David, this might shock you, but I've had two private conversations with President Trump, and I had the very same takeaway that President Trump, the man, not before the cameras, is very gracious and gentlemanly, and that's what I took away. And I thought, gosh, the world has this wrong. So isn't it interesting? Perhaps in that speech, he was actually being himself rather than playing to the camera. I mean, certainly he was playing to his audience, but I found him very gentlemanly, likable, and I dare say if most of the world saw that side of him, they might feel the same.
I suppose there's something else, and again, can I also toy with possibly something unmentionable? Was he, dare I say it, perhaps a little overawed? The full, once the full works are turned on, in the combination of the Waterloo Chamber, the State Dining Room, and particularly the St George's Hall, it is jolly hard to resist. Yes.
Well, you and I have discussed this before, and here's a man who's a billionaire. He's arguably the most powerful man in the world at the moment, and there aren't many experiences that would cause him to be overawed. But I think, as you say, the full force, what Walter Bagehot would call the magic of monarchy, was fully on display.
And he was being let into the secret.
Indeed.
This extraordinary thing, the veil is pulled back. He's sitting next to the Princess of Wales, who's engaged in informal conversation with him. The sharing jokes with the king. I mean, it is extraordinarily effective. But I mean, in other words, I think we've got to hand it, however reluctantly, to Starmer and this government, that tactic, which began in the Oval Office with Starmer presenting the letter from King Charles to the letter of invitation to Trump, that delighted pointing to the huge royal signature and effectively comparing it with his own, is clearly pulled off.